I held my phone up to the kitchen window where the morning light was strongest, squinting at the screen the way my optometrist kept telling me I needed to stop doing. The email had arrived at 6:14 a.m., before the coffee finished brewing, before I'd even put my glasses on. My son's name was right there in the sender field, but something about those words on that screen made the hair on the back of my neck stand straight up. I set the phone face down on the counter, picked up my mug, set it back down without drinking. Then I picked the phone up again and read the email one more time, slowly, the way you read something when you're hoping you misunderstood it the first time. I hadn't misunderstood anything. My name is Daniel. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years building houses in central Ohio, and I like to think I'm a man who can read a situation pretty well. You don't manage crews and subcontractors and difficult clients for 3 decades without developing a decent sense for when something is off, when the foundation isn't quite level, when the framing looks right but something underneath isn't sitting the way it should. That email wasn't from my son. I don't mean someone hacked his account. His name was on it, his email address. The subject line said, "Dad, checking in." And on the surface, if you read it fast, if you were just a father who'd been waiting 2.5 years to hear from his boy, you might have exhaled and smiled and written back immediately. But I knew my son. I knew the way he wrote. I knew the phrases he used, the rhythms of his sentences, the small private references he'd drop into conversation without explanation because he knew I'd understand them without needing one. None of that was in that email. What was in it was a request for $40,000. My son's name is Marcus. He turned 36 in February, though I didn't know that at the time because by February of last year I hadn't spoken to him in over 2 years. The last real conversation we had was a Sunday afternoon phone call in November, 2.5 years before that email arrived. He'd seemed distracted, a little flat, the way he sometimes got when something was weighing on him, but he hadn't decided yet whether to talk about it. I asked if everything was all right. He said yes. I asked about his wife. There was a pause that lasted maybe 2 seconds too long before he said she was fine. Her name is Nicole. They met when Marcus was working in Pittsburgh, married 18 months later. I was at the wedding. My wife Patricia stood next to me in a yellow dress and cried the good kind of tears, and I shook Marcus's hand and pulled him into a hug and told him I was proud of him. Nicole's family was from outside Philadelphia. Her father gave a toast that was mostly about himself. I noted that privately and said nothing. The first year was fine, as far as I could tell. Marcus called regularly. He and Nicole came out for Thanksgiving. She was polite at the table, quieter than I'd expected for someone who had such strong opinions about how the turkey should be carved and where everyone should sit. Patricia made her famous sweet potato casserole, and Nicole mentioned twice that she normally avoided refined sugar. I noted that privately, too. By the second year, the calls got shorter. By the third year, they were down to once a month, then once every 6 weeks. Patricia noticed before I admitted it to myself. She has always been better at naming things than I am. She said one evening while we were washing dishes, "Nicole doesn't want him calling us," and I told her she was reading into things. I believed that when I said it. I don't anymore. The last time I saw my son in person was at his grandmother's funeral, my mother, 14 months before the silence started. He came alone. He said Nicole had a prior commitment. My mother had loved Marcus more than she was willing to say out loud, and he sat in the front pew with his jaw tight the whole service, and when we got back to the house afterward, he walked out to the backyard, where my father used to have a garden, and just stood there for a while. I went out and stood with him. We didn't say much. He left before dinner. The calls tapered off after that. Then they stopped. I tried. I want to be clear about that because it matters to me that it's clear. I called. I left voicemails. I sent emails that I kept deliberately short and low pressure, saying only that I was thinking of him, that I loved him, that there was no obligation to respond immediately. I sent a card at Christmas with a short note inside. Patricia sent one too. We didn't discuss coordinating them. We just both did it separately, which I think says something about how much we both needed to reach out. None of it got a response. After 14 months of silence, I called Marcus's cell number, and a recording told me the number was no longer in service. I sat with that for a long time, A disconnected number means either he lost the phone, or he got a new one and didn't give me the new number, or he deliberately got a new one, so I couldn't reach him. I tried not to think about which of those was most likely. Patricia suggested we drive to Pittsburgh. I said we should wait a little longer, give him space, respect his choices. She gave me a look that I have seen across 38 years of marriage, and that look means she disagrees, but she loves me enough not to push. I think about that look sometimes now. I think about how different things might have gone if I'd listened to her instead of to my own stubborn need to believe my son would come back on his own terms when he was ready. Then the email came. I read it a third time, standing at the kitchen counter in my socks. The writing was formal in a way Marcus never was with me. Stiff in the places he would have been easy. There was a sentence near the middle that read, "I hope this message finds you and Mother well." And I actually laughed out loud at that. A short, involuntary sound, because Marcus had called Patricia Mom since he was old enough to talk. He had never once in his life referred to her as Mother, not even as a joke. The email explained that Marcus had been going through a difficult period financially. It said he and Nicole had made some investments that hadn't performed as expected, and they were facing a short-term cash flow problem that would be resolved within 90 days, and $40,000 would allow them to bridge the gap without having to sell assets below market value. It said he would repay the full amount with interest. It gave wire transfer instructions. It said he was sorry for the long silence and hoped we could reconnect soon. I put my phone in my pocket and walked to the back door and stood looking out at the yard. It was early April. The forsythia along the back fence had just started to bloom. The same forsythia Patricia had planted the spring after Marcus was born, because she said she wanted something that would come back bright and loud every year, whether the winter had been hard or not. Marcus used to run through it as a little kid, those yellow branches catching at his jacket, and he'd come inside with pieces of it stuck in his hair. I thought about my son, the real one, the one who called his mother Mom, and who would never in a million years send his father a business-style email asking for $40,000 after 2.5 years of silence. The one who, if he actually needed help, would have called me, would have stumbled through it, gotten embarrassed, made a bad joke to cut the tension. That's how Marcus asked for things. Badly, sideways, the way men in our family always have. Whoever sent that email had met my son, had access to his account, and at least some information about our family. But they did not know him, not the way I did. I went back inside and told Patricia. She read the email twice, and I watched her face move through the same sequence mine, had the initial relief at seeing his name, the slow, careful reading, the change in her expression as something settled. She handed the phone back to me and said, "That's not Marcus." "No," I said. "It's not. What are we going to do?" I'd been thinking about that since 14 inches the morning. The answer I arrived at was not the answer I might have given 2 years earlier, when I was still telling myself to give him space and respect his process, and all the other things you tell yourself when the truth is too uncomfortable to look at directly. 2 years of silence had burned away a lot of that softness. What was left was just the hard part underneath. "I'm going to find him," I said. I called my buddy Ray first. Ray and I have been friends since high school, and he spent 22 years as a sheriff's deputy before his knees gave out, and he retired to run a small security consulting business out of his garage. I trusted his judgment on this kind of thing more than anyone else I knew. I explained the situation, and he listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I've always respected about Ray. When I finished, he said, "You need to report it." I said I wasn't sure there was anything to report yet. He said, "Daniel, someone sent you a fraudulent email from your son's account soliciting $40,000. That's wire fraud. That's a federal matter. You report it." I said I was more concerned about Marcus than about the money. "Both things can be true," Ray said. "You report the fraud and you find your son. One doesn't stop the other." Then he gave me a name, a private investigator he'd worked with over the years. A former state police detective named Garrett, who operated out of Columbus, and who Ray said was meticulous, discreet, and not cheap, but worth it. I called Garrett that same afternoon. He asked me a series of questions in a calm, organized way that reminded me of the best contractors I'd ever worked with. Men who looked at a problem without drama and just started identifying what information they needed. He wanted to know Marcus's full name, date of birth, last known address, social security number if I had it, the names of his employer as of 2.5 years ago, Nicole's maiden name, her family's location, any mutual friends or contacts Marcus might have maintained. He asked about the email, the wire transfer instructions, what bank, what account routing. He said he'd look into it and check back within a week. He called back in 4 days. What he told me over the phone that Thursday evening, while I sat at the kitchen table and Patricia stood at the counter pretending to look through the mail, rearranged everything I thought I understood about the previous 2.5 years. Marcus was still in the Pittsburgh area. He was still employed, or had been as recently as 8 months ago, at the same civil engineering firm where he'd been working when the silence started. Garrett had spoken to a former colleague of Marcus's who still worked there, a man named Phil, who had apparently been Marcus's closest friend at the company. Phil had not seen Marcus in over a year. Marcus had stopped coming to team happy hours, stopped responding to personal texts, declined 3 separate invitations to Phil's backyard cookouts with excuses that Phil described as increasingly generic and unlike him. Phil's word for Nicole, when Garrett eventually guided the conversation there, was controlling. He said he'd noticed years ago that Marcus's participation in anything social outside their immediate home seemed to require negotiation, that Nicole always seemed to know where Marcus was and who he was with in a way that went beyond normal partnership. He said Marcus had once shown up to a work lunch with a bruise on his forearm and changed the subject when Phil asked about it. I set the phone down on the table for a moment after Garrett told me that. I needed a second. Patricia looked up from the mail. I shook my head slightly, meaning wait, and picked the phone back up. Garrett continued. The cell number that had been disconnected was a number Marcus had had since college. The new number, which Garrett had obtained through methods he described only as standard investigative practice, was registered to a joint account with Nicole. The email account that had sent me the fraudulent message was Marcus's, but Garrett had reason to believe the password had been changed. Based on his preliminary work, Garrett suspected Nicole had sent that email herself, using Marcus's account, likely without Marcus's knowledge. The wire transfer instructions routed to an account in Nicole's name. "Where is my son right now?" I asked. "Is he safe?" Garrett paused in a way that meant he was choosing his words carefully. He said Marcus appeared to be physically present and functional, meaning he was going to work, he was not hospitalized, there were no missing persons flags. But Garrett said the pattern he was describing, the isolation from family and friends, the controlled communication, the financial consolidation, the bruise Phil had mentioned was consistent with what professionals in the field called coercive control. He recommended I involve law enforcement regarding the wire fraud, and he said there were domestic violence advocacy organizations that specialized in exactly this type of situation, including situations involving male victims, which were frequently underreported and undersupported. He said, "Your son may not know yet that he's allowed to leave." I drove to Pittsburgh 3 days later. Patricia came with me. She had always been right about this, and I was not going to tell her to stay home again. We didn't go to the house. Garrett had advised against it. Nicole would be there, and showing up at the house unannounced would almost certainly trigger a defensive response that would make everything harder. Instead, Garrett had found out through Phil that Marcus still ate lunch at the same sandwich shop 2 blocks from his office on Tuesdays and Thursdays, usually between noon and 12:30, usually alone. It was a Thursday. I parked down the block from the sandwich shop at 11:45. Patricia brought a thermos of coffee and didn't say anything about the fact that my hands weren't quite steady when I poured it. We sat there. We watched the street. At 12:17, I saw my son walk out of his office building and turn left on the sidewalk in the direction of the sandwich shop, and I had to grip the door handle for a moment before I got out of the car. He looked thinner than I remembered. The way a person looks when they've been under sustained pressure for a long time, and the pressure has started to show up in their body. He was wearing a jacket I didn't recognize, his shoulders slightly hunched against the April wind, his head down, and he hadn't seen us yet, and I stood on the sidewalk and said his name. He stopped. He turned around. I watched his face go through something I can't fully describe: surprise, confusion, and then something that cracked open in a way that hurt to look at. He stood there on the sidewalk, and his face did the thing it used to do when he was small and had been trying to hold something in for too long. And I crossed the distance between us and put my arms around my son, and he grabbed onto me like a man who has been underwater. We went into the sandwich shop. Patricia held both his hands across the small table and cried without trying to hide it, and Marcus sat there looking at us with the expression of someone who has almost forgotten what it felt like to be looked at like that. He ordered a coffee he didn't drink. His hands moved in that restless way they'd had when he was a teenager and anxious about something. I told him about the email. I watched his face when I said it. He closed his eyes. He pressed his lips together. Then he said, "She told me she reached out to you months ago and you never responded." "She told you that?" "She said she sent you an email from my account because my phone was broken and she needed to let you know we were doing fine and didn't need the family checking in." Patricia made a sound. I reached over and took her hand. "Marcus," I said carefully, "we never got that email. The only email we received from your account was 3 weeks ago asking for $40,000 wired to an account in Nicole's name." He stared at the table. His jaw worked. A long silence passed, during which the sounds of the sandwich shop, the espresso machine, 2 women talking in the booth behind us, the door opening and closing, all seemed very distant. "I didn't send that," he said finally. "I know you didn't." He looked up at me and his eyes were red at the edges. "How long has this been going on?" "What do you mean? How long has she—" He stopped. Started again. "My phone, my email. She said she was managing our accounts to be more organized, that it was just efficient. She's been—" He pressed his fist against his mouth for a moment. Phil stopped reaching out. "I thought he was just busy. I thought you and Mom I thought you'd given up on me." "Marcus," Patricia said, "we have never given up on you. Not for one single day." I had gone to that sandwich shop prepared for a lot of different versions of this conversation. I had prepared for him to be defensive, or to not believe me, or to take Nicole's side, because 2.5 years of controlled information had made her version of reality feel like the only one. I was prepared for him to ask me to leave. I was not fully prepared for the version where my son sat across from me in a sandwich shop and realized in real time that the silence he'd been living in was not chosen. We talked for 2 hours. The sandwich shop filled up and emptied out around us and refilled again. Marcus told me things slowly, the way you work something loose that's been stuck for a long time. He told me about the early years with Nicole that had seemed fine, but in retrospect had a pattern he hadn't recognized yet. The way decisions got made, the way her unhappiness always seemed to land on him to solve. The way friendships outside the two of them had gradually become more trouble than they were worth. The way his paycheck went into a joint account he technically had access to, but that Nicole managed, and the way needing to explain any personal expenditure above $20 had started to seem normal. He told me about the bruise on his arm. He'd burned it on a pan, he said, the first time. The second time was a coffee mug. He'd told Phil it was nothing because at the time that's what it felt like, not a pattern, just incidents. He'd told himself the same thing. "I need to talk to someone," he said. "Someone who isn't you. A professional." "I know," I said. "I have a name." 3 days after we drove home, I went to the Pittsburgh field office and filed a formal report regarding the wire fraud. I brought the email, the bank account information Garrett had found, and a written statement. They were professional and thorough and asked good questions. Garrett had advised me to document everything, and I had. I had printed the email. I had screenshotted the wire transfer instructions. I had written down the timeline of our contact attempts over the previous 2.5 years, with dates and methods. Every card, every voicemail, every email from our end that had never received a response. The investigative process takes time. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. It was not the swift, satisfying thing you see in movies. But what I can tell you is that 3 weeks after I filed that report, Nicole was interviewed by federal investigators about the fraudulent email. And in the course of that investigation, it became clear that this had not been a single incident. There were other financial accounts. There were other communications that had been intercepted or fabricated. The picture that emerged was not a simple one, but it was a clear one. Marcus had moved out by then. He'd taken 2 weeks to prepare, during which he quietly moved certain documents and personal items to Phil's apartment for safekeeping. On a Friday morning in early May, while Nicole was at a scheduled appointment, he packed what fit in his car and drove to a hotel and called me from the parking lot. I answered on the first ring. "I'm out, Dad," he said. I had to sit down. He came back to Ohio for 2 weeks while he got his footing. He slept in his old room, which Patricia had kept exactly as it was, with the quiet stubbornness of a woman who refuses to give up on something. He ate breakfast with us every morning and looked gradually less like a man who'd been carrying too much for too long. He met with a therapist twice a week. He started sleeping more than 5 hours a night. There was a morning about 10 days into his stay when I came downstairs early and found him at the kitchen table with both hands wrapped around a coffee mug, just sitting with it. He was looking out the window at the forsythia, which was still in bloom. I poured myself a cup and sat down across from him, and we didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, "I kept thinking, in those last months, that if I could just fix whatever I'd done to push everyone away, things would go back to normal. I thought it was me." I looked at my son, at the lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before, at the set of his shoulders, which were starting to loosen. "None of it was you," I said. He nodded slowly. "I know that now." A pause. "I'm still learning to know that." "That's all right," I said. "You've got time." He came back to Ohio 2 more times that summer. In July, he drove out for the 4th, and Patricia made potato salad, and we sat on the back deck and watched the neighborhood fireworks go off above the tree line. And Marcus laughed at something Patricia said, a real laugh, the kind that reaches the eyes. And I looked at him in the dark and thought about all the 4ths we'd missed. Then I thought about this one, which we hadn't. In September, he called me on a Tuesday evening, not for any particular reason, just to talk. We were on the phone for 40 minutes. He told me about a project at work he was excited about. He asked about the house, whether I'd finally gotten the gutters replaced. I told him no. I'd gotten quotes, and they were highway robbery. And he said, "Dad, you say that every year and every year the gutters get worse." And I said, "Well, every year they get worse and I still have to live with them, so maybe the gutters and I have reached an understanding." And he laughed again, that same laugh. I said goodnight. I sat in the living room for a few minutes after we hung up. Patricia came in and asked who I'd been talking to. I told her Marcus. She sat down on the couch and smiled the smile she has when something is restored to her, when something that was missing comes back. It is not a triumphant smile. It is quieter than that. It is the smile of a woman who planted forsythia because she knew some winters would be long. I want to say something to anyone watching this who might recognize pieces of this story. Not the specific details, your situation is your own, but the shape of it. The long silence. The sense that something is wrong, but you can't quite prove it. The temptation to wait, to give it time, to keep telling yourself that space is respectful, rather than that silence is a message. I waited too long. I don't say that to punish myself, because I don't think blame is the most useful thing here. I say it because I want someone watching this at 6 in the morning with their phone in their hand, reading a message that doesn't sound like the person who sent it, to know that the instinct you have in that moment is worth listening to. My son didn't send that email, but in trying to understand that email, I found my son. And I don't think I would have found him without that email, because I'd been letting patience become passivity for 2 years before that, and he'd been letting confusion become numbness for even longer. It took a fraud to shake us both loose. We are not the same as we were. Marcus is in therapy and doing the work of rebuilding something that was quietly dismantled over the better part of a decade. Patricia and I are in our early 60s, and we are aware in a way we weren't 10 years ago that time is a thing you spend, not a thing you have. The relationships that matter require maintenance. They require showing up. They require not waiting for the other person to come back on their own, when all the evidence suggests they might not know how. Marcus called last week to tell me he's been offered a senior position at his firm. I told him I wasn't surprised, because I wasn't. He worked for it and he deserved it. He said he'd been thinking about coming out for Thanksgiving, if that was all right. I said it was more than all right. Patricia, who had been standing 10 feet away pretending not to listen, immediately started talking about the menu. There is a photograph on our refrigerator. It's from a camping trip Marcus and I took when he was 11, somewhere in the Wayne National Forest. He's standing on a rock at the edge of a creek, arms out for balance, grinning so hard his eyes are almost closed. I have walked past that photograph thousands of times over the past 30 years. During the silence, I stopped being able to look at it without the weight of everything it was next to, everything that was absent. I would walk past and feel it in my chest and look away. I don't look away anymore. He's coming for Thanksgiving. He'll sleep in his old room. We'll sit at the table that has held every meal this family has ever eaten together, and Patricia will make the sweet potato casserole, the one she makes every year without asking because she knows it's his favorite. And I will sit across from my son and not need to say everything that's happened because we lived it and we know it, and it will all be there in the room with us, lightened by the fact that we are there together. The forsythia will be done by then, but it will come back. It always comes back. If you're still with me at this point, thank you for listening. These stories are not easy to tell. They're not easy to live through, and they're not easy to put into words. And the reason I put them into words anyway is because I believe someone out there needs to hear them. Someone who is in the middle of a silence right now and doesn't know yet that silences can end. Someone who got a message this morning that didn't feel right and is trying to decide whether to trust that feeling. Trust it. Go find your person. Don't wait until you have proof of every single thing, because by the time you have proof of every single thing, you may have waited through another year that you can't get back. Go find them with what you have. Ask the questions that are hard to ask. Make the drive. Sit down across from them in whatever sandwich shop or diner or kitchen table is available and say their name, and see what happens when they turn around and realize someone came. That's what parents do. That's what family does, when it's functioning the way it's supposed to. My son came home. Maybe yours can too.